Hello everyone and welcome to the next video in my Bridgerton inspired series. And in this video I will be sharing how I made this pink dress, which is of course inspired by the gorgeous gowns worn in Bridgerton. Now this video is a bit of an updated version of my older Bridgerton dress video. However, this time I have made and included a pattern in my Etsy so that hopefully you can download it, follow along, and make a dress like this for yourself. And this dress does feature the double dart on the bodice as well as a full circle skirt. And now that season 2 is out, I'm very inspired, so let's get started. First thing you'll want to do is go to my Etsy shop and download the PDF pattern. Then you can print the pattern out on the correct paper size at 100% scale. After printing, on the first page, check the measurements. It should be 5 by 5 centimeters. And if everything is looking good, you can start assembling the pattern. To assemble the pattern, you're just going to trim the margins and tape the pages together to create a grid. The grid is made up of 54 pages, which is a pretty big pattern, and that is to accommodate the circle skirt of the dress. The next thing to do is to cut the pattern to your size. I will be cutting my pattern to size 38 since I have a 38-inch bust. And before cutting, you can check the length of the skirt pattern piece and adjust it to better fit your height. You can measure from your indicated waistline down to the bottom edge of the skirt. And you can trim the bottom edge a little shorter or a little longer to suit your measurements. But please keep in mind to add a few centimeters to your measurement to account for the waist seam and hem. Now before cutting into your nice fabric, I highly suggest you make a mock-up. At the very least, make a mock-up of the bodice pieces so you can check the fit and make note of any changes you may want. You may want the neckline to be cut deeper or less deep. You may want to adjust the darts to better fit your bust, and you can check and see if the optional 1 centimeter of allowance on the back piece is needed. This will be based on whatever back closure you choose. And after checking the fit of everything with your mock-up and making sure everything is to your preference and taste, you can then move on and start cutting out your fabric pieces. As you can see, I have opened my fabric up to the full width and folded it twice so that there are 4 layers of fabric, and so that I can cut my skirt piece on the fold of the fabric 2 times. You could opt instead to cut the skirt twice and then once on the fold if you would prefer to have a back seam on your skirt. I also cut out 2 sleeves, 2 sleeve bands, 4 back pieces, 2 for the outer layer and 2 for the lining, and 2 bodice pieces, both on the fold, 1 for the outer layer and 1 for the lining. And depending on what fabric you're using, you may want to cut an additional layer out in cotton for the bodice front and back and sleeve band to use as interlining. Next, you can use chalk or pins to transfer the dart placement to your bodice pieces. After using chalk to transfer my darts to the bodice front and lining pieces, I then basted my darts in place. Now there are different ways to prepare your darts. You can use pins and pin them in place, or you can go straight to the machine. But I prefer basting by hand first and then machine stitching. Basting the darts first is especially helpful if you decide to add a layer of interlining to the bodice. The interlining may help add body and support to a thinner or flimsy outer layer fabric. And by basting first, you can ensure that the outer layer and interlining layer are secure together. After your darts are secure, you can stitch them in place. Then I just fold my darts towards the back of my bodice and tack them down. After the darts have been sewn into my bodice outer and lining layers, I can now join the bodice front to the bodice back at the curved side seam. With right sides together, I pin the curved edges and then stitch them. I then like to finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. And do be sure to repeat for the other side and the lining layer. And this is how your bodice should look. Next, we can join the front of the bodice to the back of the bodice at the shoulders. We will pin the shoulders together, straight stitch, and again, I'd like to finish this raw edge with a zigzag stitch. Next, I will prepare the sleeve so that it can be fit into the arm side. First, I like to gather down the bottom edge of my sleeve so that it is the same length as my sleeve band. I like to use a straight stitch on a long length, and then I just pull the thread of that stitch to gather down the bottom edge of my sleeve. Next, I match the right side of my sleeve band to the wrong side of my sleeve and pin the edges together. Then I stitch the bottom edge of my sleeve to my sleeve band, making sure to stitch just a little bit over my gathering line of stitches. And of course, I finish the raw edge with a zigzag stitch. And here's how the sleeve band should look once attached to your sleeve. Now we can fold the sleeve band over 2 times. We're going to fold it once to hide the raw edge of the sleeve band, and we're going to fold it a second time, covering the seam allowance, and we're going to pin it down in place, just a little bit overlapping our previous line of stitches. And this is what's going to create that bottom cuff or sleeve band for our puff sleeve. Once the sleeve band is pinned in place, you can take it to the machine and top stitch it down. Next, I like to match the sides of my sleeves together and join them with a French seam. You of course could opt, instead of a French seam, to just finish the raw edges with a zigzag stitch, and this is totally up to you. But again, we're just sewing the sides of the sleeve together, preparing them so that we can insert them into the arm side of our bodice. Now for my back shoulder seam, I like to measure and mark 11 centimeters. This is because I like to focus the volume of my puff sleeves to the back and the top of my armhole. Now you may prefer spreading out your gathers on your sleeve. Feel free to experiment with your mock-up and make notes of your gather preferences. After marking my gather placement with chalk, I match the correct sleeve to the correct side of the bodice. The seam where the front of your bodice is joined to the back is where your sleeve should begin. and the sleeve should wrap around towards the front of the bodice. The skinny part of the sleeve at the underarm and the larger part gathered at the top. Right sides together, pin your sleeve into the arm side of your bodice, and the extra bulk of the sleeve can be gathered or pleated down to fit the armhole. Now you will have to work very carefully and slowly as you match the sleeve into the arm side of the bodice. Use pins and carefully match the two edges together. You may want to use a long stitch on the top of the sleeve and gather it down that way. You could also create small pleats and pin them in place. I prefer small pleats, but again, this is totally up to you. Once your sleeve has been matched into the armhole of your bodice, you can now stitch them together. And again, I like to finish this raw edge with a zigzag stitch. Next, I'm going to add the lining to my bodice outer layer. I match my bodice outer layer to my lining and pin together, right sides touching. And I pin along the back edges and all around the neckline. Once everything has been pinned in place, I stitch these edges together. I also take a quick moment to zigzag stitch the raw edges of my lining layer. Next, I clip into the seam allowance along the neckline of my bodice. That way it's easier to turn right side out and the neckline will lie smoothly. Next, I turn my bodice right side out and then I press the neckline and back edge with an iron so that it lies smoothly and looks very clean and crisp. Next, I will prepare the skirt to add to the bodice. Now I have decided to cut a small slit into the back of my skirt piece and then bind it and add a zipper closure to the back of my dress. But whatever back closure you decide to use is totally optional and could affect the way you sew and finish the back of your dress. First, I have to decide how long I want to cut the slit into the center back of my skirt. I measure the remainder of the zipper not sewn to the bodice and then cut the slit into the center back skirt piece. Next, I tidy the raw edge with bias tape. I stitch the right side of the bias tape facing the wrong side of the cut slit. I stitch and then fold the bias tape over and top stitch it down for a clean finished edge. Afterwards, I miter the corner of my bias binding. Now again, the back closure and the way you cut your back skirt piece will affect how you finish the back of your dress. You may find that adding hooks and eyes or buttons are easier, or you may prefer to add a back seam to the back panel of your skirt. Next, I match the front piece of my skirt to the back piece, pinning the sides together and stitching the edges. I like to finish the side seams of my skirt using a French seam, but this is totally optional and you can use an alternative finishing method. Now that the skirt is ready, we can attach it to the bodice along its waist edge. Move your lining layer out of the way and match the skirt's waist edge to only the outer layer of the bodice along its waist edge. Start by matching the center front of the bodice to the center front of the skirt, right sides together. Pin as you work towards the back. Pin the skirt smoothly to the bodice until you reach the side back seam of the bodice. You will now pleat down the remainder of your fabric, fitting it to the back bodice piece. Once the skirt has been pinned to the bodice, you can stitch and finish the raw edge. As you can see, the extra fabric on the waist edge of your skirt is what will be pleated down to match the back panel of your bodice. You could, of course, opt instead of pleats to just gather the back edge and fit it to the bodice, but I like the clean, crisp look of the pleats. But this is totally optional and up to you. You can also see that I'm taking extra care when matching the back edges of my skirt to the back edges of my bodice. And this is how everything should look once the skirt has been pinned to the bodice. Again, make sure the lining layer is moved out of the way, and now you can take it to the machine and stitch these edges together and finish the raw edge. Here is how the bodice should look once sewn to the skirt. As you can see, the lining is only sewn to the back edge and neckline of the bodice, not to the armholes or waist. Next, fold the lining inside the dress, and then you can inside out your entire dress. The wrong side of the dress will be showing, and the right side of the lining will be facing you. We can now fold the edges of the armholes and waist inwards and hand stitch the lining to the seam allowance of our dress. I like to first smooth the lining to the bodice, matching the darts and seams of the two layers together, and then folding the edge and pinning it in place. Once I am satisfied that my lining is sitting smoothly against the outer layer of my bodice, I go ahead and hand stitch that folded edge of my lining to the seam allowance of the outer layer of my bodice. And I hand stitch around both armholes and the entire waist edge of my dress. Now this method can be a little bit time consuming, just having to hand sew all of these edges, but I like that it hides all of the seam allowance and edges, and it gives it a very clean, tidy finish. So I do think it's worth it. But of course, this is totally up to you. Instead of lining, you could just opt to bind the neckline. Next, I pin my zipper into the back edge of my dress, and the back edge of my bodice and my skirt are finished. My skirt has been finished with the bias binding, and the back edge has been sewn and the lining sewn down. Once my zipper is pinned in place, I just baste it in the back. And again, I like basting because it's a really great way to secure that zipper into place. It makes it easier when you go to the machine, and I feel like it keeps things a little bit tidier. And you can remove the pins so there's less chance of getting poked. But the way you add your zipper is totally up to you. And of course, adding a zipper is totally optional. You again may opt for buttons or hooks and eyes or even tie closures at the back of your dress. Feel free to add whatever closure suits you best. The last thing to do is trim and then hem the bottom edge of your dress. Because the skirt is a circle skirt, Parts of the skirt are on the bias and there may be some warping. First, let your dress hang overnight, and then the next day try on your dress or put it on a mannequin and mark with chalk or pins where you would like to cut your dress. You will want to cut your dress to make the bottom hem even. After indicating where you would like to cut it, you can lie your dress out. You can even match the sides together and then cut along your marked lines. Try on your dress one more time and make sure there's not any spots that need some fine tuning or a second trim. Once the bottom of your dress is even, you can now take it to the machine and give it a very simple rolled hem. Now I like to straight stitch it, folding the bottom edge up one time. Then I might trim any extra seam allowance if needed, and I'll fold it a second time and straight stitch it down. And I like to do it this way because I feel like it's the best way to keep the bottom hem nice and smooth. But again, you could hem the bottom of your dress any way you prefer. And now the dress is finished, so let's see what it looks like. And thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this video and would like to see more DIY videos and more Bridgerton content, definitely like and subscribe. Thank you. Bye.